The morning sun cast long shadows across the NATO training facility as soldiers from various nations gathered for the annual joint military exercise. Among the sea of camouflage uniforms and combat boots, one figure stood out not for her imposing presence, but for how others seemed to deliberately ignore her existence. Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her gear and checked her equipment one final time. At 28, she had already served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, but her slight frame and quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate her capabilities. Today would be no different, she thought, as she noticed the sideways glances and whispered conversations around her. The exercise was designed to test inter-unit cooperation and combat readiness. Teams from the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and France would work together in various scenarios. Sarah had been assigned to a mixed unit, but from the moment she approached her designated group, the reception was less than welcoming. "Great! They gave us the desk jockey," muttered Sergeant Hans Müller from the German contingent, not bothering to lower his voice. His comment drew chuckles from several nearby soldiers. Sarah had heard variations of this comment countless times throughout her career, but it still stung. Lieutenant James Crawford from the British Royal Marines looked her up and down skeptically. "Are you sure you're in the right place? The medical tent is over there," he said, pointing in the opposite direction. More laughter followed, and Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she remained silent. The French soldiers were equally dismissive. Corporal Antoine Dubois shook his head as he examined the team roster. "This is ridiculous. We are supposed to complete combat scenarios with someone who looks like she belongs in an office, not a battlefield." Sarah had faced this type of treatment before, but it never got easier. In a male-dominated field, she had learned to let her actions speak louder than words, though sometimes the constant need to prove herself felt exhausting. She focused on her breathing and tried to maintain her composure as the mockery continued. As the teams prepared for the first scenario, a hostage rescue simulation, Sarah noticed that her supposed teammates were actively excluding her from their planning discussions. They huddled together, speaking in hushed tones while casting occasional glances in her direction. When she approached to contribute her input, they would either ignore her or give dismissive responses. "Look, sweetheart," said Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez from the U.S. Army Rangers, "why don't you just stay back and let the real soldiers handle this? You can write up the report afterward." His condescending tone made Sarah's hands clench into fists, but she maintained her professional demeanor. The morning progressed with Sarah being systematically excluded from every aspect of the team's operations. During equipment checks, they would hand her the least important gear. During briefings, they would talk over her when she tried to speak. During tactical discussions, they would dismiss her suggestions without consideration. What her teammates didn't know was that Sarah had specifically requested to participate in this exercise not as a regular infantry soldier, but as part of a classified evaluation program. Her real identity and credentials were sealed in a folder that only the commanding officers possessed, and she had strict instructions not to reveal her true background unless absolutely necessary. As the first scenario began, Sarah found herself relegated to a support role, despite her extensive experience in similar operations. She watched as her teammates made tactical errors that she could have prevented, but every time she tried to speak up, she was told to stay quiet and follow orders. The hostage rescue simulation was a disaster. The team's poor coordination and refusal to listen to Sarah's insights led to multiple casualties and a failed mission. As they gathered for the debrief, the blame shifting began immediately. "If we had a real soldier instead of dead weight, we might have succeeded," grumbled Sergeant Müller, looking directly at Sarah. The others nodded in agreement, seemingly oblivious to their own mistakes. Sarah felt her patience wearing thin, but she knew that revealing her true identity prematurely would defeat the purpose of the evaluation. She had to endure this treatment a little longer, even though every fiber of her being wanted to set the record straight. As they prepared for the afternoon scenarios, the mockery intensified. Soldiers from other units had apparently heard about the weak link on the team and came by to see for themselves. Sarah became the subject of jokes and ridicule throughout the training ground. "I hear they're letting anyone join the military these days," laughed a soldier from another unit. "Next thing you know, they'll be recruiting from office buildings." The afternoon brought a new set of challenges, including a combat patrol simulation and an urban warfare exercise. Once again, Sarah was marginalized and ignored, forced to watch as her teammates made preventable mistakes. The cumulative effect of the constant disrespect was beginning to take its toll, but she reminded herself that this was all part of a larger purpose. As evening approached, Sarah noticed a familiar figure observing the exercises from a distance. Commander Jack Sullivan, a Navy SEAL with a reputation that preceded him wherever he went, was watching the proceedings with keen interest. Sarah had heard stories about Sullivan's legendary career, his numerous commendations, and his no-nonsense approach to military excellence. What Sarah didn't know was that Commander Sullivan had been specifically briefed about her true identity and was part of the evaluation process. He had been watching the day's events unfold with growing concern about how she was being treated by her supposed teammates. The sun was beginning to set as the final exercise of the day concluded. Sarah's team had performed poorly once again, and the blame continued to be directed at her despite her limited involvement in the actual operations. She stood alone, checking her equipment and preparing to head back to the barracks, when she overheard a conversation that would change everything. A group of soldiers from various units had gathered nearby, and their discussion centered on her. The comments were becoming increasingly personal and vicious, moving beyond simple professional skepticism to outright cruelty. "I bet she only got here because of some diversity quota," said one soldier. "Real soldiers are getting passed over, so people like her can play dress-up." "Someone should tell her that this isn't a costume party," added another, provoking more laughter from the group. Sarah felt something snap inside her. She had endured professional skepticism, tactical disagreements, and even casual dismissiveness, but the personal attacks crossed a line. Her hand unconsciously moved to the patch on her uniform, hidden beneath a protective flap that she had been instructed to keep covered. The patch represented years of sacrifice, countless missions, and achievements that most soldiers could only dream of. It represented the true reason she was at this exercise, and the real purpose behind all the mockery and dismissal she had endured. As the laughter continued behind her, Sarah made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of the training exercise. Tomorrow she would reveal exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. But tonight, she would let them continue their mockery, knowing that their attitudes would soon be put to the ultimate test. The stage was set for a revelation that would shock everyone present and force them to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. Sarah Mitchell was about to show them all exactly what a real soldier looked like. The next morning arrived with thick fog rolling across the training facility, creating an atmosphere that seemed to match the tension Sarah felt building inside her. She had barely slept, replaying the previous day's events and preparing herself for what was to come. Today's exercise would be different, she had decided. Today, she would stop hiding who she really was. As soldiers gathered for the morning briefing, the same dismissive attitudes from the previous day were immediately apparent. Sarah's assigned teammates barely acknowledged her presence, and when they did, it was with the same condescending remarks that had become routine. "I hope you're ready for some real action today, office lady," sneered Sergeant Muller, adjusting his combat gear with exaggerated importance. "We're doing live ammunition exercises, not filing paperwork." The morning's first scenario was announced, a high-stakes hostage extraction in an urban environment with live ammunition and real explosives. The exercise was designed to test advanced tactical skills and would require precise coordination, expert marksmanship, and split-second decision-making abilities. As the teams received their briefings, Sarah noticed Commander Sullivan positioned at the observation post, his intense gaze focused on the proceedings. She also noticed several other high-ranking officers she didn't recognize, all watching with unusual interest for what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. The scenario briefing revealed a complex situation: multiple hostages held in a 3-story building, armed hostiles with unknown capabilities, and strict rules of engagement to minimize civilian casualties. It was exactly the type of mission that Sarah had executed successfully dozens of times in real combat situations, but her teammates continued to treat her as a liability. "All right, here's the plan," announced Lieutenant Crawford, deliberately positioning himself so that his back was to Sarah. "Rodriguez and Muller will take point, Dubois will provide overwatch, and I'll coordinate the breach. The civilian," he said, glancing dismissively at Sarah, "can stay with the equipment and call for backup if needed." Sarah felt her frustration reach a boiling point. Being relegated to equipment duty during a complex tactical operation was not just insulting, it was potentially dangerous for everyone involved. She had critical insights that could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Lieutenant," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her mounting anger, "I have experience with this type of operation. You should consider alternative breach points and—" "Listen, sweetheart," interrupted Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. "We don't need advice from someone who probably learned everything she knows from training manuals. This is real-world stuff." The dismissal was the final straw. Sarah felt years of accumulated frustration and professional disrespect converge into a moment of absolute clarity. She reached for the protected flap on her uniform and began to unfasten it, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Actually," Sarah said, her voice taking on a different tone entirely, "I think you might want to reconsider that statement." As she spoke, several soldiers from other units began to gather around, drawn by what they sensed was an escalating confrontation. The mockery and laughter that had characterized the previous day's interactions continued, with soldiers making jokes about Sarah finally losing it under pressure. "Oh, this should be good," laughed one observer. "Is she going to threaten to report us to Human Resources?" But Commander Sullivan, watching from his observation post, suddenly straightened in his chair. Something about Sarah's demeanor had changed completely, and he recognized the transformation immediately. The uncertain, defensive woman from the previous day had been replaced by someone with the bearing and confidence of a seasoned combat veteran. Sarah's fingers worked methodically at the protective covering, and as she pulled it away, a collective silence began to fall over the assembled soldiers. Underneath the plain exterior covering was a patch that made everyone within viewing distance stop talking immediately. The patch bore the distinctive insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. But that wasn't what caused the sudden silence. Below the Ranger tab was another qualification badge that made several nearby soldiers take an involuntary step backward. The Special Forces tab, followed by combat deployment ribbons that represented more combat experience than most of the assembled soldiers had collectively. But even that wasn't what caused Staff Sergeant Rodriguez to stop mid-sentence with his mouth hanging open. At the bottom of the patch array was something that made Commander Sullivan rise from his seat, the Silver Star Medal Ribbon, one of the military's highest honors for valor in combat. "Holy," whispered Corporal Dubois, his previous arrogance evaporating instantly. Sarah stood perfectly still as the reality of her qualifications sank in around her. The Ranger tab alone commanded respect in any military setting, but the combination of Special Forces qualification, multiple combat deployment ribbons, and valor decorations created a level of credibility that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Lieutenant Crawford's face had gone pale as he processed what he was seeing. You're a Ranger?" "I was a Ranger," Sarah corrected, her voice carrying a new authority that made everyone lean forward to listen. I was also Special Forces qualified. I served 5 combat deployments across 3 different theaters of operation. The Silver Star was for actions during a hostage rescue mission in Syria, where my unit saved 14 civilian contractors while outnumbered 3-1. The transformation in the crowd's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who had been laughing and making jokes moments before now stood at attention, their previous mockery replaced by obvious embarrassment and respect. Sergeant Muller, who had been particularly vocal in his dismissiveness, looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Ma'am, we didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Sarah replied, her tone professional but firm. "You made assumptions based on appearance rather than capability. In a real combat situation, that kind of thinking gets people killed." Commander Sullivan began making his way down from the observation post, his expression unreadable but his pace urgent. As he approached, other soldiers instinctively moved aside, creating a clear path between him and Sarah. The revelation had completely changed the dynamic of the entire exercise, but Sarah wasn't finished. She had more to reveal, and the final piece of information would explain exactly why she had been subjected to this treatment and what the real purpose of her presence at the exercise actually was. "The reason I'm here," Sarah continued, addressing not just her immediate teammates but the growing crowd of onlookers, "is not to participate in routine training exercises. I'm here as part of a psychological evaluation study on unconscious bias in military units." The implications of that statement began to sink in as soldiers realized they had been unknowingly participating in an assessment of their own prejudices and professional judgment. Every interaction, every dismissive comment, every decision to exclude me from planning sessions has been documented and analyzed, Sarah explained. The purpose is to identify systemic issues in unit cohesion and combat effectiveness when female soldiers are present. Commander Sullivan had reached the group, and his presence added an additional layer of gravity to the situation. As he approached Sarah, his expression was serious but not unkind. "Captain Mitchell," he said, using her rank for the first time since the exercise began, "I think it's time for a full debrief." Commander Sullivan's presence changed everything about the situation. As one of the most respected SEAL commanders in the NATO alliance, his word carried enormous weight, and his obvious recognition of Sarah's credentials sent shockwaves through the assembled soldiers. "Gentlemen," Commander Sullivan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I believe you owe Captain Mitchell your attention and your respect." The transformation was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had spent the previous day treating Sarah as an unwelcome burden now stood at attention, their faces reflecting a mixture of embarrassment, respect, and growing understanding of how badly they had misjudged the situation. Commander Sullivan continued, his gaze moving across the faces of the soldiers who had participated in the mockery. "Captain Mitchell is not just a decorated combat veteran. She's one of the most accomplished special operations soldiers I've ever had the privilege of working with." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the commander, but also a sense of validation that went beyond simple professional recognition. For too long, she had been forced to hide her accomplishments and endure disrespect simply because she didn't fit the traditional image of what a soldier should look like. "Sir," Lieutenant Crawford said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we had no idea." "That's exactly the point," Commander Sullivan replied sharply. "You had no idea because you didn't bother to find out. You made assumptions based on appearance and gender rather than seeking to understand her qualifications and experience." The commander turned to address the larger group of soldiers who had gathered to witness the confrontation. "This exercise has revealed serious deficiencies in how we evaluate and integrate personnel in joint operations. The mockery and dismissal that Captain Mitchell endured represents a failure of military professionalism that could prove catastrophic in actual combat situations." Sarah stepped forward, feeling emboldened by the commander's support and ready to share the full truth about her background and the real purpose of her presence at the exercise. The mission in Syria that earned me the Silver Star involved a hostage rescue operation very similar to today's exercise scenario, she explained. 14 civilian contractors were being held by a terrorist cell in a compound outside Damascus. My unit was tasked with their extraction, but intelligence reports severely underestimated the enemy presence. The assembled soldiers listened with rapt attention as Sarah recounted details of a mission that most of them could barely imagine surviving, let alone executing successfully. We arrived to find 3 times as many hostiles as expected, with superior positioning and heavy weapons. The original extraction plan was impossible to execute, so I had to develop alternative tactics on the ground while under fire. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been particularly dismissive of Sarah's tactical suggestions, now listened with obvious fascination and growing respect. I identified a weakness in their perimeter defense and led a flanking maneuver that allowed my team to breach the compound from an unexpected direction. During the firefight that followed, I personally eliminated 6 enemy combatants while providing cover for the hostage evacuation. The silence that followed was profound. Every soldier present understood the level of skill, courage, and tactical expertise required to execute such a mission successfully. Sergeant Meller, who had made numerous disparaging comments about Sarah's capabilities, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. Our behavior was unacceptable and unprofessional." Sarah nodded, accepting the apology, but also recognizing an opportunity to drive home the larger lesson that this entire exercise was designed to teach. The problem isn't just individual prejudice, she explained. It's systemic assumptions that prevent military units from utilizing all available resources effectively. In combat, those assumptions can mean the difference between mission success and mission failure. Commander Sullivan stepped forward again, his expression serious as he addressed the fundamental issues that the exercise had revealed. Captain Mitchell's presence here was part of a broader evaluation of unconscious bias in joint military operations, he announced. Every interaction, every dismissive comment, every tactical decision that excluded her input has been documented and will be analyzed to improve future training protocols. The implications of that statement began to sink in as soldiers realized the full scope of what had transpired over the previous 2 days. The purpose, Sarah continued, was to identify how gender bias affects unit cohesion and combat effectiveness in real-world scenarios. Unfortunately, the results have confirmed many of our worst fears about systemic discrimination in military settings. Lieutenant Crawford looked visibly shaken as he processed the implications. "So every time we excluded you from planning sessions, every time we dismissed your suggestions, it was noted and evaluated," Sarah confirmed. "Your tactical decisions consistently ignored valuable input that could have improved mission outcomes." Commander Sullivan addressed the group with the gravity of someone delivering a critical lesson that could save lives in future operations. "The exercise scenarios that you struggled with yesterday and today are scenarios that Captain Mitchell has successfully executed in actual combat situations. Her tactical suggestions weren't theoretical. They were based on proven real-world experience. The weight of their mistakes was becoming clear to everyone present. They had not only treated a decorated war hero with disrespect, but they had also compromised their own tactical effectiveness by refusing to consider her input. Sarah saw this as an opportunity to turn a negative situation into a positive learning experience for everyone involved. "The goal isn't to assign blame or create guilt," she said, addressing the soldiers who had participated in the mockery. "The goal is to recognize that effective military units utilize every available resource, regardless of whether that resource looks like what we traditionally expect." Over the next several hours, Commander Sullivan and Sarah conducted detailed debriefings with each unit that had participated in the exercise. The conversations were often difficult, as soldiers were forced to confront their own biases and acknowledge how those biases had affected their professional judgment. But the debriefings also revealed positive changes. Once soldiers understood Sarah's true background and qualifications, they became genuinely interested in learning from her experience and expertise. Sergeant Muller, who had been among the most dismissive, approached Sarah privately during a break in the proceedings. "Ma'am," he said, his tone completely different from his earlier condescension, "would you be willing to walk us through the tactical approach you would have used for yesterday's hostage rescue scenario?" Sarah agreed, and the resulting discussion became an impromptu masterclass in special operations tactics. Her detailed analysis of the scenario, alternative approaches, and lessons learned from actual combat experience provided insights that dramatically improved the unit's tactical understanding. As the day concluded, Commander Sullivan gathered all participants for a final address. "This exercise has demonstrated both our weaknesses and our potential for improvement," he said. "Captain Mitchell has shown us that excellence in military service comes in many forms, and our effectiveness as a fighting force depends on our ability to recognize and utilize that excellence wherever we find it." The transformation in attitudes was remarkable. Soldiers who had begun the exercise with dismissive or mocking attitudes toward Sarah now sought her out for tactical advice and professional mentorship. "The real test," Sarah told the assembled group during her final remarks, "is whether these lessons will be remembered and applied in future operations. Unconscious bias is called unconscious for a reason. It requires constant vigilance and intentional effort to overcome." As the NATO exercise concluded, reports would be filed and recommendations would be made to improve training protocols across all participating nations. But for the soldiers who had witnessed Sarah's revelation and learned from her expertise, the impact would be much more immediate and personal. They had learned that true military excellence isn't defined by appearance, gender, or traditional expectations. It's defined by skill, experience, courage, and the ability to accomplish the mission regardless of circumstances. Commander Sullivan's final words to the group captured the essence of what they had all experienced. "Remember this day. Remember that the next time you're tempted to make assumptions about a fellow soldier's capabilities, those assumptions might cost lives. Captain Mitchell has shown you what real strength looks like. Now it's your responsibility to apply that knowledge." As soldiers dispersed to return to their respective units and countries, they carried with them a profound lesson about respect, professionalism, and the true nature of military excellence. Sarah Mitchell had accomplished far more than just revealing her identity. She had challenged an entire system of unconscious bias and opened minds to new possibilities for what a soldier could be.